You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Life is too short for bad sex. Unfortunately, however, a lot of us are still having it anyway. We're having sex that's not serving us because we're not getting what we really want or experiencing much in the way of pleasure. And nothing makes us lose desire for sex faster than having bad sex. This is really important to recognize because bad sex is actually at the root of low sexual desire for a heck of a lot of people. But instead of recognizing this for what it really is, people often assume that there's a problem with their own sex drive, when in reality, they're simply having sex that isn't worth wanting. So, oftentimes, the solution to low desire is changing your approach to sex and making sure that the sex you're having is really worth having, because that can often make desire come roaring back. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this episode, we're going to revisit one of my favorite conversations on the show, which is my interview with Dr. Kelly Casperson that originally aired all the way back in episode 128. We had a fantastic conversation about the three main types of bad sex that people have, what it actually means to have good sex, and how to stop having bad sex. Dr. Kelly Casperson is a urologist, sex educator, author, and podcaster whose mission is empowering women to live their best love lives. She combines education, humor, and candor in her book and podcast, both of which are titled, You Are Not Broken. Her work dismantles the myths that women have learned about sex and normalizes healthy, enjoyable sex worth desiring. This is going to be another amazing conversation, brimming with practical tips and advice. Before we get to it, here is today's top 3 segment presented by Field. Field is the dating app for the curious where you can really get to know yourself. Field wants to help us develop our self-understanding through exploring our desires and curiosities. And in fact, their data show that 62% of Field members evolve their sexuality and interests in their first year on the app. To that end, our top 3 segments are designed to equip you with the knowledge you need to go on your own journey of sexual self-discovery. In these segments, my friend Ashley Weller, host of the amazing What's Your Position podcast, will be joining me and we'll be sharing our top 3 tips for exploring a different aspect of your sexuality. Today, we're diving into the subject of dirty talk. So, Ashley, are you ready to talk dirty with me?
Let's get dirty.
All right, lay it on me. So, what is your first tip for successful dirty talk?
Start with consent. Now, I don't just mean, hey, can we talk dirty? I mean, when you are going to talk dirty to someone, use what you are asking for as the dirty talk itself. Can I lick your ear? Can I come closer to you? Can I caress your breast? Can I lick your toe? Like, asking for permission can sometimes be the most erotic thing you can do. It also sets you up for getting consent to what you are about to play with. Or, can I tell you exactly how I want you to spank me? That's so hot. Get out of here. Like, are you kidding me? Using consent and asking if you can do things in a sexy way is probably one of the easiest, most entry-level ways of starting dirty talk.
Yeah, and I think you're so right that consent and dirty talk can definitely go hand in hand. And, you can be doing multiple things at once, right? You're getting consent while also increasing sexual excitement. I know some people, when they hear about things like this concept of affirmative consent, think that that necessarily has to suck all the fun out of sex and pleasure, but it doesn't. If you're approaching it in the right way, consent can be really, really sexy, and it can be used as a form of dirty talk. So my first tip for this was to have a discussion with your partner about what dirty talk means to each of you, right? And what kinds of dirty talk you find to be appealing. Because you might ask your partner to say, talk dirty to me. And they might do it, but they might say words that end up being a turnoff to you. So for example, it can definitely be icky sometimes, right? So for example, if your partner calls you a slut in bed, some people might very much be turned on by that, whereas other people might be offended or turned off, and that might be a deal breaker for them, right? So get on the same page about what dirty talk means to each of you.
Fun fact about Ashley, I hate being called a good girl. Not a fan. Huge in the dirty talk world. Please, my second tip is to be authentic. Do not use words and phrases that give you the ick. Even if it is something that your partner wants to hear, find another way to say it. Make sure that it is natural. Don't force it. You don't have to sound like what you think a porn star sounds like. It can sound like you, just dirty.
Yeah, I think being authentic is really a key part of this because sometimes we push ourselves a little bit too far outside of our comfort zone. And then that just ends up making us feel anxious and distracted. And then that can kind of sap all the fun out of dirty talk. So my second tip was to find some inspiration. So read or listen to some erotica to get some ideas of what you might be able to say as like a sample script or starting out point. The hard part with dirty talk for a lot of people is that they don't know what to say and then they start overthinking it. And then that creates these feelings of anxiety. And then the anxiety reduces your arousal and makes it hard to have an orgasm and all these other sorts of things, right? We don't want dirty talk to be stressful. We want it to be fun. And so having some potential conversation starters or prompts that you draw from the world of erotica can be a very useful starting out point or something that you can gravitate to if you're not sure what to say next.
I think you could also pull from the last time you engaged in sexual activity with that person. I really loved the way you tasted. I really loved the feeling of you inside of me. Like you literally can just take from your last encounter and turn that into dirty talk as well. And I think people sometimes think they have to go full blown porn star and you don't. It can really be about the last time you engaged in activity with that person. My last tip would be to try it in a text because sometimes saying it out loud makes us feel silly. Not all of us are blessed with the gift of gab like you and I, Justin, and can't necessarily just say things out loud and not devil may care. So making sure that you feel comfortable by maybe testing it out in a text message. It's a great way to ease into the verbal expression. You can also reformulate it and not send it right away. You can also pull from erotica, like you say, and add some spice into it. You can also use ChatGPT to help you write a sext. I did it on an episode recently, and it was really entertaining and actually really hot.
Yeah, I love that. And it's true. I can be the world's biggest dirty talker over text, but it's different in person. It's sometimes just harder to say things in person than it is to write them out. And so my third tip on this was to take it slow. If you're not used to talking at all or even making sounds during sex, the idea of incorporating dirty talk can be a lot, right? So start by vocalizing your pleasure more through moans and groans and things like that. And then you can start incorporating short phrases like, oh, your mouth feels so good, or something along those lines, right? It'll get easier over time, but it's baby steps. And start by just adding those vocalizations and short phrases.
I think practice makes perfect. It's going to feel uncomfortable the first few times you do it.
Yeah.
But as you get reciprocal feedback, whether it be physical or verbal from your partner, you're going to start feeling more comfortable with what you're saying. And if you just start to say what actually is happening, that feels really good. I like that pressure. That's really hot. You're really just narrating the scene as it takes place. And that's dirty talk. You're doing it.
Yep. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing your tips on navigating dirty talk with us, Ashley. That wraps up our top 3 segment presented by Field. A huge thank you to our friends over at Field for sponsoring this segment and helping us to expand our horizons in the dating world and on this show. We have much more ahead on today's episode, so stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become Sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become Sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. Hi, Kelly, and welcome to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to speak with you. So I'd like to begin our conversation by asking you to tell us a little bit about your professional background. How did you get into the world of sex education and sexual medicine? What drew you to this field?
Yeah, I actually had a life-changing patient change my life. I'm a urologist, so I practice general urology. I skew towards female. I cover a lot of female urology issues. And I had this patient right around 7 years into my career. And if you look at like 7 years into a career, you get kind of good at what you do. You might get kind of bored at what you do, right? And so I was kind of having this existential, like, am I just going to see recurrent UTIs for the rest of my life situation? And she came in and we'd already been pretty bonded. I'd helped her with some cancer in her past. And she was crying in my office. Wonderful marriage, but a sexless marriage. And she was feeling very bad about it, both for her partner and for herself. And as I grabbed a box of Kleenex to give it to her, lightning struck my brain. And what I was taught in urology was women are difficult. You don't want to deal with women. Actually, you should do a fellowship so you don't have to deal with women. And we're the experts of the penis and Viagra. And lightning struck my brain and I said, well, who's taking care of the people who are supposed to be sleeping with the people we're giving Viagra to? And are all of these things that I was taught truths, or do we actually know something? Right? The other myth was that the gynecologists were taking care of all of this, so no other doctor needed to take care of it. And so I started reading all the books and going to the conferences, and it turns out we actually know a lot about female desire, arousal, orgasm, brains, but it's not how women are being taught. Of course, our sex education is horrific in this country and in a lot of the world. And then Hollywood portrays what sex should be for women in a very heteronormative, male prioritied viewpoint. So women simply aren't getting the education that is out there. And so once I learned all that, I talked to the next woman and she's like, well, I've never had an orgasm with penis and vagina sex. And I'm like, well, you're not broken. That's the way your body is, right? Most vaginas don't have orgasms by putting something in it. And, I don't have spontaneous desire. That's the next woman. I don't have spontaneous desire for sex. And I'm like, well, you're not broken. Most people in long-term relationships don't have spontaneous desire for sex. So I just started saying, you're not broken, because it turns out a little bit of education goes a long way in normalizing people's lived experiences. This little voice in my head then was like, you got to talk. You can only see so many people in your town where you're a doctor, right? And so that's where the podcast was born about 2.5 years ago now. And then came out with the book, again, titled You Are Not Broken, Stop Shoulding All Over Your Sex Life. Because it's all the shoulds, right? I should want it all the time. I should have an orgasm by putting something in my vagina. I should have the same sex drive as my partner does. You're just carrying around a backpack of bricks. You got to get those bricks off. Your life's going to be a lot lighter. So that's my story. I wasn't born into it. I truly started questioning what I had been taught or what I hadn't been taught.
Thank you for sharing that. And I love everything about that story. And, that ability to recognize that what you were taught was wrong. And there's a better way to approach this. And I hope that inspires other people in urology and in other fields of medicine to prioritize the importance of understanding and recognizing sexual health and be able to answer some of these questions that people have, or at least refer them to the right person who can help them get the help that they really need. So let's talk about bad sex. You have a chapter on this subject in your new book, and it starts with an analogy that I think is really great. You say that you have this love for Haagen-Dazs mint chocolate chip ice cream, but you would never have the desire to eat it if it was melted. So even though the same flavor profile is present in melted ice cream, it's just not good enough to want, no matter how you serve it. And it's really the same thing with sex. You might really like sex, but if you're not getting it in a way that makes it pleasurable, you're not going to want it. However, there seems to be this idea out there that when women lose desire for sex, it signifies a problem with the individual. That they were having great sex and suddenly they don't want it anymore. So there's something wrong with them. But your theory is that a lot of these women who have lost desire are just having bad sex. So it's only natural that they'd stop wanting it. So can you speak a little bit about this idea? In your experience, to what extent is lack of interest in sex usually a clinical problem with desire versus a problem with bad sex?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a wonderful question. I would love for people to do some research on this. And the reason that it was like this aha for me is I was started going, learning as much as I could about desire and really low desires. The number one sexual problem that women seek out help for, right? It's a desire. And I started learning more about it. I was actually talking to a worldwide expert on this. And I said, yeah, but shouldn't we be making sure that women are having good sex? And he was like, well, of course they're having good sex. It's just that they don't have desire. And it was of course they're having good sex, where I was like, you're coming at this probably from a very male perspective of like, you're probably having good sex every time you have sex. These women aren't, right? And is low desire just a consequence of the melted ice cream instead of a primary problem of sex is mind-blowing and awesome, I don't desire it? I'd say that's much more rare. So I'd say bad sex, if, off the cuff, I'd break down into 3 different categories. Number 1 is painful sex. Women will come to me and they'll say, I have 2 problems. I have low desire and I have pain with sex. I always take away, it's nice though when you can take away problems for people. It's like, no, you have 1 problem. You have pain with sex. We don't desire painful things. That's neuroscience, right? Like I'm never going to put my hand on a hot stove. So we avoid painful scenarios. So certainly if the sex is painful, uncomfortable, anything like that, you're not going to desire it. That's bad sex. And I was just doing a podcast with somebody, we were talking about this because it's almost not a myth, but almost a truism that women are told the first time they have sex, it will be painful. And I think that comes from our incredible lack of sex education, right? We don't talk about lubrication. We don't talk about arousal. We don't talk about what we need to do to prep her pelvis for penetration. We give her none of that information, and we just tell her it's going to be painful, like it's a given, instead of, well, that's what's going to happen if you're not prepped properly for it, and don't go slow and prioritize your pleasure, which is very interesting. So I think that's one of the bad sex buckets. The other one is not prioritizing her pleasure, right? If she's having sex for her partner, and I see this a lot, and I'm stereotyping, but in heterosexual long-term relationships, but I think it'd be anybody who's partnered with anybody. If one person wants it more and they're just having it for that person, it's not about you. And when it's not about you, we don't prioritize your pleasure. It doesn't really matter if you have pleasure because you're just doing it because your partner needs it. It's an epidemic, and I don't see it researched a lot. This almost like, I don't want it, but it's not like coercion, but it's not a hell yes. It's this very gray, not quite consensual, pleasurable sex that I think is happening everywhere. And I've looked for the research. I don't see a lot. I see a little bit in college students that's research, but not a lot in your middle-aged long-term relationship. I'm having sex. Some people will call it pity sex, right? But certainly I'd call that bad sex. And then the third one, which people don't think about, is just a repetitive, boring. So it's, pizza for dinner every single night. A lot of people don't want to have pizza for dinner every single night. And then they're like, well, I really don't desire pizza. It's like, yeah, you're just having pizza for dinner every single night. Versus if your dinner was like varied and interesting and you got to choose and maybe you get to go out sometimes and you're like, I'd like dinner. Right. So it's almost just repetitive. And couples get into that. They get into that sexual script. They get what's easy. They know what works well for one person. So they kind of get into the script of sex, not realizing might be really bad sex for one person.
So bad sex can take a lot of different forms. And I appreciate everything you said and the way you just sort of broke that down into those different categories. And as you were talking about the painful sex thing, it was making me think too about how, for example, a lot of gay men kind of learn that anal sex is going to be painful or that it's supposed to be painful. And so I think a lot of them are kind of approaching it with that same mindset, going in. If you expect it to be painful, it's probably going to be painful.
Yes.
But you need to know how to prepare and how to make sex pleasurable. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, sex ed is pretty shitty, and we don't do a very good job of teaching people how to have pleasurable sex of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to bad sex, one of the categories centers around people kind of having sex because they feel like they should do it. They're supposed to do it. Maybe because their partner has a higher sex drive than them. And so they feel like they're supposed to keep up in some way, or they have that sort of obligatory sex where maybe an anniversary or Valentine's Day or whatever is coming up and they feel like, sex is an obligation I have to do for my relationship. Or something else you described in the book is this idea of checklist sex where, sex just becomes another chore around the house. So why is it a bad idea to have sex because you think it's something you should do instead of something you really want to do?
Yeah, a lot of it's mindset, right? Number one, I think mindset of like, if it's for you, there's kind of an inherent justification of it being pleasurable instead of like just getting it over with, right? Number one, it's just for that person, your spouse, and then you're tired anyways, so you put it right before bed, so you're already exhausted. Like, to me, like, this is a setup for you not enjoying sex. And then you add the extra weight of like now thinking you're the problem because you have the low desire for this thing that you do when you're exhausted at the end of the day for your spouse or for your significant other. And to me, it's like to prioritize it as important for you and them. And I think the way people are socialized, especially the way women are socialized in our society of, what do we call women who like sex in our society? We actually call them bad names. So we are socialized to don't be the bad name, but then now there's a problem with us because we don't want sex. So it's really this double-edged sword. But I think a lot of relationships, especially heterosexual or just disparate mismatched sex drive, which again is normal, 2 people, 1 house, different desires for pizza and beer and coffee and sex, like just to normalize 2 different people. But there's almost this like male default of like the higher sex drive is the one to which you should be compared. But again, the double-edged sword of if you have a female who has a higher sex drive than the male, she's still the problem, right? We're really comparing her to where the male standard is. Instead of thinking of it as a relationship, what works for the relationship? How much sex works for the relationship instead of how much sex works for this one person's level of desire, and then let's circle around that for the eternity of our relationship.
So many important points there. And if you find yourself going into sex frequently saying to yourself, all right, let's get this over with, that's a bad sign, right? That is not the kind of sex that you deserve. And you should really rethink your approach to sex and whether this relationship and the way you're having sex is really meeting your needs and what you can do differently about that. Now, another kind of sex that you talk about that is a form of bad sex in your book is when sex becomes this bartering chip in a relationship where either you withhold sex or you offer sex as a way of trying to change your partner's behavior. So, for example, you talked about a story where this woman said that her husband would give her a point every time they had sex so that she could redeem it for other things. Like, what the fuck is that? It's like you're turning sex into this crappy carnival game at the state fair where you collect tickets and you can later redeem it for some poorly stitched stuffed animal. It's like,
yeah, or a nice pair of shoes.
Yeah. So why is it a bad idea to use sex as a bargaining chip, whether it's withholding sex or, trying to use sex to reward your partner in some way?
Yeah. I mean, and again, I always chalk this up to like the sex education is just so bad, right? Of like how incredibly wonderful sex can be, how incredibly intimate and vulnerable in a good way and pleasurable and, time with your partner. Sex can be so amazing. But if we don't ever get taught that, we never get taught what feels good for you. How do you communicate that? How do you say, I want to have equal pleasure to you when we have sex together? We never get taught that. And so it like ends up going down these like horrific carnival rides of like doom and despair of like, it's easy for us to say, well, women should just have the sex they want, right? But she never figured that out in the first place. Sex for her was always putting a penis in her vagina in a heterosexual relationship. And we know that doesn't lead to orgasm in 70% of women. This is always kind of my challenge of like when, we as the experts say like a woman should really have sex that's for her, realizing she may have never, ever had that before in her life. And to almost honor like where these people are coming from, because we've done such a poor job of saying it was ever for you. And now we're like, it should be about you. And they're like, what? I have to undo like 30 years of sex here. So it's a very big deal. But I mean, I see these women, they come into my office and, let's say they're 50, the kids are out of the house, they were feeling pretty bad. Maybe they got on hormones, they started exercising, they started prioritizing their orgasms. They come in and they're like, what else is there? This is amazing. I've got the rest of my life. Like, you see that start of a sexually confident woman and it's energy like you've never seen. It is so cool. And so, like, only to share with your listeners, like, this is totally possible. We're just kind of saying, have you ever thought that sex could be for you? Because I guarantee you a lot of women have never even thought that it could be for her.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And yes, it is so beautiful to see someone who becomes sexually confident and has that sexual awakening and can take control of their pleasure and their sexual health and all of these things at the same time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the joy that shines through their face. It's like so exciting to be around. Like, bottle that, you'll solve the energy crisis.
Yes. And, when somebody is sexually confident, that can spill over into other aspects of their life. Like, they just carry themselves differently. And so, it can be one of the keys to just a more rewarding, fulfilling, happy life in general.
Yeah. There's data on that too. Like, confident in the bedroom is confident in the boardroom, of like, what's a yes, what's a no, how to ask for what you want. There's so many tools in discovering, your own agency in sex that easily spill into non-sexual areas of your life.
Absolutely.
If you needed another reason, right?
Dating apps can be frustrating for many reasons, but one of the big ones is that it often feels like no one is really being their authentic self. This gets tiresome and frustrating after a while. But what if there was a space where you could not only be yourself, but find yourself? On Field, an app where curious people come to connect, you have room to explore your own desires and go on a journey wherein the person you discover is yourself. Wondering what it's like on Field? It's a place where transparency is key. You'll quickly find that people regularly practice honesty and openness. Just see any Field bio. Whether it's about the relationship structures you're interested in or experiences you'd like to explore, this is a place where you'll find people who are honest about what they're looking for. It's also a space without all of the pressure and expectations. You can feel free to find true expressions of yourself. Go on a journey of self-discovery today with Field. Download Field, that's F-E-E-L-D, on the App Store or Google Play. So we've talked a lot about bad sex and the different forms it can take. Let's talk about good sex now. So how do you define good sex?
I think it can be very individualized for the person, right? I bet if you polled, 100 people, you get 100 different answers. But really feeling like it was for you, and if it was partnered, right? Because good sex can be alone. Here we are overgeneralizing, saying it's partnered, but good sex can be alone. But when it's partnered, feeling like you were seen, feeling like you were cared for, feeling like you were desired, feeling like you were an equal, if that's what you wanted to do. So I'd say there's some universal truths in what good sex is.
Yeah, and I totally agree that it is highly subjective because different people might get different things out of sex. That's something that might also change at different stages of the lifespan. So what made for good sex when you were a horny teenager might be very different from when you're in, say, your 40s and 50s, So there's a lot of variability in this over time, but it's ultimately about getting what you want and what you need out of sex at that particular point in life and in that particular relationship circumstance. And you're right, you can have good sex by yourself. You can have it with one other partner. You can have it with multiple other partners, right? So again, it looks different for different people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's important to highlight when we're talking about good sex that we're not necessarily talking about perfect sex, because striving for perfect sex can be problematic too, because sex is rarely perfect.
Yeah.
It can be a little bit messy. Things might not go according to your plan, and your body might not do exactly what you want it to do at the exact right time. And this is why I think the concept of good enough sex is so great, because it acknowledges that our sexual experiences can and will vary, and that perfection isn't the goal. So can you speak a little bit about this idea of good enough sex?
Yeah, I think it's Barry McCarthy who wrote this amazing book. It is It's rekindling desire. He talks about good enough sex, and it's so important for people to hear this. I kind of akin it to like playing a sport, right? Of like, let's say you play basketball. We'll just pick something. If you're only happy or is only good when it was a perfect, flawless game, it's rarely that, right? And it's like just playing the game is what's enjoyable, not, shooting perfectly, landing everything perfectly, all that stuff. And it's also very forgiving for our bodies. Like, sometimes penises don't work. Sometimes vulvas don't get as wet. Sometimes orgasms don't happen. And it's almost that pressuring, and there's good research on this of like pressuring your partner to have an orgasm makes the orgasm more elusive, right? So pressuring for an endpoint or pressuring for a performance goal actually adds cortisol and orgasm don't mix. And so it's that pressure to have it go a certain way. It's almost, like being able to play a piece of music of like, you don't know where it's going, but it's a beautiful thing to listen to.
Your description of that resonates with me a lot. You can apply this model to anything. I can apply it to podcasting and say, my approach with this has to be that it needs to be good enough. Like podcast recordings are rarely perfect. There's always some technological issue or something else that happens, stumbles, other things that go on behind the scenes that the listener never ends up hearing. There's a lot that ends up on the cutting room floor, but you can't expect perfection because you'll just never get there. And it would just take me forever to produce a single episode if I was just going for perfection every time. And it's really the same mindset you need to have when it comes to sex, when it comes to work. It's the only way that you're going to get that work-life balance that we all want and are looking for. Because if we're always striving for perfection in everything, it becomes so mentally and emotionally taxing. At some point you have to say, this is good enough for me. And so that's I think a healthy way, a healthy mindset for approaching sex and pretty much everything else in life.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's like, wouldn't it be awesome if sex ed included like good enough sex? I truly believe like sex ed's usually taught junior high school, right? Of like, once you turn 30, 35, there should be like a new adult sex ed. That's like, okay, now you've had an experience of being an adult. Now you've had an experience of actually being in a relationship. How about you learn the concept of good enough sex now? Because I'm like, I don't know when you're like 15, if that's the right age to learn about good enough sex. But man, it's super useful when you get older.
Yeah, I'm thinking about as a teenager, just having a partner was good enough when it came to sex because, your body's just in this heightened state of arousal, like perpetually, and everything is kind of easy. I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but it's just the way your body works when you have those raging hormones is different from how your body operates a little bit later on when you're in different developmental periods. So another way to think about good enough sex is to think, okay, what are my non-negotiable things? Like the things that I absolutely have to have for it to be good enough sex. And then what are the extra things that would just make it even better? The icing on the cake, so these are the things that are optional. They don't have to happen every time, but if they do happen, great. That just makes it even better. So it's sort of just getting to that place of I'm getting the essentials and everything else that happens is just a fantastic bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so much kindness for you and your partner too, to not need it to be perfect, right? Especially like after you have a baby, or maybe there's some erectile dysfunction issues, or after menopause, like our bodies continue to change and evolve and age. And it's just such a more loving way to keep sexuality within your life of knowing that it's not going to be perfect every single time. And it's just, again, playing the game, being together, connecting, experiencing your body for where it is today is such a more beautiful thing. But again, look at what Hollywood tells us. Look at what porn tells us. Like that's all curated, edited, the 50th take, but we're watching perfection. So of course, how easily it is for us to take that into the bedroom.
Yes. So how do we make the transition from bad sex to good sex? Now, the answer is obviously multifaceted. It's complex, but let's talk about where you even begin with this. So let's say you've had the realization that you're not wanting sex because it just hasn't been good enough to want for you. So where do you begin in terms of changing this? Does this start by working on yourself first? Do you start by talking to your partner about it? What's your advice for sort of how to begin this journey from bad sex to good sex?
Yeah. Well, first I want to talk about what humans usually do, right? And then be like, well, maybe we should start somewhere else. But what we usually do is we want quick fixes and we want to change other people. So that means we go on the internet, we purchase something, and then we tell our partner they're doing something wrong. That's just the way our brains work. We want quick fixes and we'd like to change other people because then we don't have to do anything on ourselves. But what I would suggest is to start with just an awareness of where you are with things. Just be like, okay, what does sex mean to me right now? Right? How do I feel about sex right now? Just to kind of understand the water that you're swimming in. And then to be like, well, somebody said that sex can be like amazing and orgasmic and close to God, dude, in your awareness of your body, like all these things of like, I've heard sex could be like this. And just realize like sex is different things to different people. I always start with just an awareness of where you are. So number 2, I think would just be education of understanding your body, right? Like what feels good to me? What doesn't feel good? And a lot of women, if you were to ask, again, let's say it doesn't have to be a woman, anybody who's having bad sex, and be like, what would great sex be? And you're like, I have no idea. I've never had it. Like, you're like, what would walking on the moon be like? I have no idea. I've never done it, right? So instead you can say, well, what's not good for you? And a lot of people can identify like, I feel numb. I feel disconnected from my body. I feel like they're just putting something in me and I don't feel connected. So it's pretty easy for somebody to describe what's not pleasurable. So I say usually start there. Because saying, well, what would feel good it's like a moon landing for them. They don't know. So you can almost reverse engineer it then and be like, okay, what does being connected to your own body feel like? What feels good to you? What works? And a lot of this, again, for people who are socialized as women, masturbation is very bad. The words for our body parts are banned on Instagram, right? Like I just got kicked off of a reel because I said vagina. So it's like our body parts are not our own and saying like they're worthy of touch and exploring. It's okay to touch yourself. And so even that's kind of a leap for a lot of people. But so I'd say starting there, then bring in your partner and you can be like, I was listening to this podcast and it turns out that 70% of women don't have an orgasm by putting something in their vagina. That was mind-blowing to me. You can just start like sharing things of what you've learned to engage your partner instead of being like, you don't give me an orgasm. Like it's more like, let's share the knowledge. I would love to see if I could have as many orgasms as you. I would love to see if I could love sex as much as you. I have no idea how to do that. Can you help me? And almost like engage and bring them in.
I think that's all well said and fantastic advice. And unlike social media, you can say vagina, vulva, clitoris as much as you want on my podcast.
That's what's so great about podcasts. Exactly.
No fucking filters. We can say whatever we want. So, that is one of the limitations of trying to get your sex ed from social media, because a lot of sex educators kind of have to do sex ed in disguise. And it's kind of this regressive thing where, we finally got to the point where we could say words like clitoris and vulva. And then we have these social media companies saying, no, that's dirty. That's bad. You can't do that. And censorship is just insane. So you have to know where to go to find the right information. And I think that's where podcasts and, books like the ones that you and I've written can be really helpful augments to helping people to better understand themselves. So I know we're running short on time here, but I have one more question for you about this good sex, bad sex thing. So as both a physician and a sex educator, can you give us your top 2 or 3 tips on how to improve the sex that you're having? And I'm especially curious if you have any tips that you think just aren't discussed often enough or that might not be intuitive. I mean, we always hear the importance of communication, for example, but good sex, great sex is about so much more than that. So what are some of your other favorite tips for having really good sex or good enough sex?
Yeah, I'll start with one that I don't see a lot, but I think can be very helpful is start on your own for about 5 to 10 minutes. Like, I wouldn't say that that's in the top 10 for a lot of people, but it's like, especially if you're like the average normal human who's like busy job, cortisol, checklist, like you're in your sympathetic nervous system and it's go, go, go. And now your partner might be like, want to have sex? And you're like, no. Right? Like I'm in the sympathetic cortisol. You're just going to be a to-do list for me. Of like, you know what? Yeah, our relationship being sexual is important to me, but I need like 5 to 10 minutes by myself, whether that's yoga, a bath, you and a vibrator, you and massage oil, just getting into your body and relaxing and working on that mindfulness, centering in the present moment, I think can be huge for you enjoying sex, because we're not light switches, and we're like, okay, kids are in bed, let's have sex. And they're like, well, I didn't enjoy it. And it's like your body and mind weren't tuned in. So I'd say like spend some 5 to 10 minutes tuning into your own is a top tip. Don't have sex right before bed. Like we get older, we're tired. We're competing with something like we will die if we don't get proper sleep. We won't die if we don't have sex. Eventually our species may, but I doubt it. But like, we're competing with something that like literally it shortens your life if you don't have sleep, prioritizing sex during your kids' nap time or when your kids are in school or before brunch or before you go out to dinner. Dr. Ruth always said, have sex before you go out to dinner. I think she was onto something. So yeah, it's just paying attention to like not being totally exhausted. Here's the other thing that I think people don't learn how to do is like, what does sex mean to you? And what does sex mean to your partner? Because we always assume other people think just like us, right? And their reason for having sex might be very different than your reason. And just understanding that about yourself and your partner might open up like a very interesting conversation. Because there's two different people, the people who like need to be connected before they have sex and the people who have sex to be connected. And they might both be living in the same house and not even know it.
I think that's all fantastic advice. And I appreciate you bringing up these things that, aren't the primary go-to tips that you hear all the time. And I really like the piece about, how solo play can be part of partnered sex. It can be a warm-up or lead into it. And, sometimes solo play comes afterwards, right? Because some people, when they have sex that is really good, that just revs up their sex drive and they want it more. And so they will masturbate after sex as well and maybe have more orgasms. And, there are some people who look at that as something to be threatened by, like, oh, the sex wasn't good enough. But, that can actually be a sign that the sex was really fucking good. So think about ways that you can incorporate solo play into partnered sex and, change your mindset when it comes to how you think about these things.
Totally.
So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Kelly. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm on Instagram at Kelly Casperson MD, and my podcast is You Are Not Broken. Amazon carries the book, You're Not Broken. Stop shitting all over your sex life.
Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.